The call came on a Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday, the most ordinary, unassuming day of the week, the one that never expects to be remembered. For 24 years, my life had been a long, quiet corridor of Tuesdays. I ran a small, clean floral shop in a neighborhood where people still sent bouquets for apologies and congratulations. My hands, which had once been soft, were now practical things, calloused from thorns and stained with the green blood of stems. I had built a life of deliberate smallness, a life that did not draw attention. I had learned that attention was a currency I could not afford to possess. The first thing I heard wasn't the ring. It was the silence before it. The way the tiny bell above my shop door, which had been chiming all morning with deliveries and early customers, suddenly fell still. The air grew heavy, dense, the way it does before a storm. Then the phone on the counter, an old landline I kept for the illusion of permanence, rang once, twice. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked it up. "Hello," I said, my voice practiced and pleasant. "Blooms on 6th. A pause. Not the pause of someone gathering their thoughts, but a weighted, deliberate silence. I could feel the shape of it against my ear. It had texture. I had spent 2 decades trying to forget that particular texture of silence. "Hannah," a voice said, just my name, not a question, a statement of fact. The world tilted on its axis. The scent of freesia and damp earth, usually a comfort, became cloying, thick in my throat. It was a voice I had not heard in 8,766 days. I had counted in the beginning. I counted the days, then the weeks, then the months, until the numbers became too large and the counting itself became a kind of madness. The voice was different, of course. Lower, a bit rougher, like a stone that had been worn smooth by a relentless river. But it was him, Kwon. The certainty of it was a physical blow, a fist to the solar plexus that stole my breath. I told myself I should hang up. I told myself that whatever he was selling, I was not buying, not anymore. Both of those were true. And yet my hand, the one that knew how to coax life from dormant bulbs and comfort the grieving with lilies, was frozen to the receiver. My knuckles were white. "You need to come," he said. Not a request, not a command either. It was presented as an inevitability, a law of physics. "I'm fine," I said. The old reflex, the wall I had built brick by brick, lie by lie. The words tasted like ash. "I am fine." It was my shield and my cage. "It's not about you," he said, and for the first time, a fissure of something I couldn't name. Not anger, not fear, something colder, cracked the gravel of his tone. "It's about him. Him." There was only one him that could exist in the space between us. A ghost who had his father's eyes and my own stubborn heart. Gene, our son. The boy I had raised in whispers. The one whose history I had edited and redacted until it was a story so full of holes it barely held together. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. The lie was flimsy, a torn piece of silk. We both knew it. I could hear his breath, a slow, controlled exhalation. He was giving me a moment to take it back. I didn't. I had guarded this lie for 24 years. It was the most precious, terrible thing I owned. "He is here," Kwon said. "In this city. He is making his presence known." My shop, my small, safe world, suddenly felt like a house of glass. The sunlight slanting through the front window seemed accusatory. The vibrant pinks and yellows of the ranunculus on my counter were garish, mocking. "What does that have to—" I started, but he cut me off. "He is using your name, Hannah. The name you gave him. Lee Jin-woo. He is using it like a key." My breath hitched. Lee was my name. The name I had taken back. The name I had scrubbed clean and given to my son, so he would have a piece of a life untouched by Kwon's world. I had wanted him to be anonymous. Ordinary. A Tuesday. Instead, he had taken his ordinary name and turned it into a weapon. "Car is waiting," Kwon said. "Black sedan. Corner of 6th and Morrison. It will be there in 11 minutes. He hung up. There was no goodbye. There never was with him. Just the clean, sharp severance of a connection. I stood there, holding the dead receiver, until the dial tone became a scream in my ear. 11 minutes. The obsessive precision of it was so familiar it made my teeth ache. It was his signature. The world bent to his timetable. I had 11 minutes to decide whether to step back into the past or to let it consume my son. I told myself it was a choice. I knew, even as I thought it, that I was lying. There was no choice. There never had been. I slowly untied my apron, the familiar fabric a useless talisman against the coming dark. I laid it on the counter, next to a half-finished arrangement of white tulips. For a moment, I considered locking the door, turning the sign to closed, but I didn't. I just walked out, leaving the door unlocked, the flowers waiting, as if I fully expected to come back. The car was exactly where he said it would be, a slash of polished black against the gray pavement. It was aggressively out of place in my neighborhood of dented minivans and dusty pickups. It didn't have plates. Of course it didn't. The windows were tinted so dark they reflected my own pale, shocked face back at me. A woman I barely recognized. The last 24 years had drawn fine lines around her eyes, had put a tension in her jaw that was now her resting state. The back door opened with a soft, expensive click. Not by itself. A man in a dark suit, his face a study in impassivity, held it for me. Mr. Choi. He hadn't aged a day. He had simply become more himself, more granite, more shadow. He inclined his head a fraction of an inch. It was the closest he would ever come to a greeting. I got in. The door closed with a heavy, soundless thud, sealing out the world. The noise of the city, the distant sirens, the chatter of pedestrians, the rumble of a bus vanished. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was the same silence from the phone call. Dense. Weighted. The car smelled of leather and something else. A faint, clean scent like ozone after a lightning strike. It was the smell of power. The car pulled away from the curb so smoothly I barely felt the motion. I watched my little shop, my little life, recede in the window until it was just another storefront on a long, indifferent street. Then it was gone. We drove for what felt like an eternity, though the clock on the recessed console told me it was only 17 minutes. We moved through the city like a phantom, the traffic seeming to part for us. No red lights. No dilas. Kwan's world did not have red lights. We ascended, spiraling up through wealthier and wealthier districts until the buildings themselves were sharp, angular expressions of dominance. We pulled into an underground garage that was cleaner and quieter than most hospitals. Mr. Choi opened my door. I followed him to a private elevator. There were no buttons to press. He placed a thumb on a small, dark panel and the doors slid open. We ascended in perfect silence. My ears popped. The elevator opened directly into a room. I could not call it an apartment or a penthouse. It was a space, a vast expanse of glass and steel and stone that seemed to hang suspended over the city. The view was breathtaking and terrible. The entire metropolitan sprawl was laid out below us, a glittering, intricate circuit board of human lives, all of them small and distant, indifferent. The room was furnished with an ascetic's discipline. A low black sofa, a single stone table, a wall of books that I suspected were never read. It was a room designed to reveal nothing about its occupant. And there, in the center of it all, standing before the wall of glass, was Kwan. His back was to me. He was wearing a simple gray sweater and dark trousers. He looked thinner than I remembered, but the line of his shoulders was still the same. A posture of absolute, unshakable stillness. He didn't turn around. I knew he was aware of my presence. The rooms he occupied always reorganized themselves around him, the very air bending to his will. I stood there, just inside the elevator, my purse clutched in my hands like a shield. I counted the seconds of silence. 1, 2, 3. It was a contest. It had always been a contest. You came, he said finally. His voice, without the filter of the phone, was quieter. It didn't need to be loud. It was the still point around which the world turned. He turned, then, slowly. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. The last time I had seen his face, it was in the dim light of a hospital room, strained and pale. Now, the light from the vast window was unforgiving. The 24 years were there, etched in faint lines around his eyes, in the silver that threaded his temples. But the eyes themselves were the same, dark, intelligent, and utterly opaque. They held the same quiet, devastating power. He was no longer the young, reckless man who had captured my heart. He was something more formidable.
Something de permanent.
Our son, he said, and the words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of 2.5 decades of silence. He is trying to start a war, and he is using you as the first shot. My throat was dry. I swallowed. The sound was loud in the cavernous silence. Why? I managed. Why me? Why now? He took 2 steps toward me. The carpet absorbed the sound like a secret. He stopped, leaving a careful distance between us. A no-man's land of memory and regret. His gaze was steady, intense, as if he were trying to read the past 24 years on my face. Because he knows, Kwon said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He knows you are the only thing I have ever been afraid to lose. Past tense, I thought. He used the past tense. I told myself it was a slip of the tongue, a grammatical error, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was not. For him, every word was a choice weighed and measured before it was released into the world. It was a confession and it was a warning, and I was standing in the epicenter of both. The air was thin up here. I felt dizzy, unmoored. I had spent so long building a life on solid ground, and in the space of an hour, he had put me back on the edge of a cliff. I looked past him at the city spread out below, a tapestry of lights just beginning to flicker on as dusk fell. It was enormous. It was continuous. And from this height, it looked like it could swallow you whole. I will not be managed, Kwon, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I am not a piece on your board. Not anymore. He didn't reply immediately. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. An almost smile, a flicker of something at the corner of his mouth, came and went so quickly I thought I might have imagined it. It was a ghost of an expression I remembered well. It was the one that appeared when I showed a flash of the fire he'd first been drawn to. I know, he said simply. That is why this is difficult. He wants to dismantle my world. Hannah. He has spent years, it seems, studying it, finding the weak points, and he has concluded, correctly, that the single greatest vulnerability I have is the memory of you. The memory of me. I felt like a ghost in my own life story. I am right here, I wanted to scream. I am not a memory. I am a woman who runs a flower shop on 6th Street. A woman whose hands hurt at the end of the day. A woman who eats leftovers standing over the sink. But I said nothing. The silence was its own language, and we were both fluent. He thinks you are my weakness, Kwon continued, his gaze drifting to the window, to the sprawling city below. He is wrong. You were my only strength. Sending you away was the hardest thing I have ever done. It was also the only good thing. I told myself he was manipulating me. I told myself this was a performance, a carefully calibrated speech designed to draw me back into his orbit for his own purposes. That was the only narrative that made sense, the only one that kept my carefully constructed walls intact. But the truth, the treacherous and unwelcome truth, was that a part of me, a small, foolish 24-year-old part of me, believed him. Where is he? I asked, the question tight in my chest. Jean, where is our son? Kwon's eyes met mine again. The opaque curtain dropped for a fraction of a second, and in that instant, I saw something that looked like pain. A deep, ancient pain. He is everywhere, he said, and he is nowhere. He has made himself a phantom, but he will make a mistake. They always do. They get impatient. And when he does, I need to know where you are. I need to be able to protect you. There it was. The word. Protect. The word that had been the reason and the justification for everything. The word that had shattered my life and, I was now beginning to understand, had shattered his too. I don't need your protection, I said, the words automatic, a creed I had lived by. I have been on my own for a long time. Every morning, he said, his voice soft but relentless. For 24 years. Every morning. The first thing I have done is confirm that you are safe, that the shop is open, that your life is undisturbed. It was a protection you never saw. A silence I paid for. I can no longer afford that silence. I stared at him, my mind reeling. The quiet predictability of my life, the very thing I had prided myself on creating, had been a curated illusion. A garden tended by a ghost. My autonomy, my fierce, hard-won independence, had been underwritten by the very man I had fled. The revelation was dizzying, infuriating, and, in a way that terrified me, deeply touching. The room felt too large, the air too thin. I wrapped my arms around myself, a gesture of self-preservation. "What do you want me to do?" I whispered. He was silent for a long moment. 3 seconds. 4. I counted. He was weighing his words. "I want you to let me keep you safe," he said finally. "Not in secret. Not from a distance. I want you to stay here, until this is over." Here? In this sterile, beautiful prison in the sky? The idea was suffocating. It was everything I had run from. "No," I said, the word a small, hard stone in my mouth. "I will not be kept." His jaw tightened. A muscle worked there, the only sign of the control he was exerting. He had expected this. He had known I would say it. "This is not a negotiation, Hannah." "And that is why I will not stay," I replied, finding a sliver of my old strength. "You think this is about my safety. It is about your control. You want to put me in a box until the danger passes. I will not live in a box. Not for you. Not for anyone." I turned to leave, my heart pounding. I expected a hand on my arm, a command. I expected Mr. Choi to materialize and block the elevator. But there was nothing. Only his voice, following me as I reached the door. "Then where will you go?" he asked. It was a genuine question. It was the first question he had asked that did not have a predetermined answer. Cost him something to ask it. "I will go home," I said, without turning back. "To my life. The one I built." The elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside, my back rigid. I did not look at him. The doors began to close, and in the shrinking sliver of the room, I saw him take a single step forward. "He knows where home is, Hannah," he said, and the words were not a threat, but a statement of terrible fact. The doors slid shut, encasing me in silence and chrome and the chilling truth of his words. The ride down was a descent into a reality I no longer recognized. The world I returned to was the same, but I was different. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked alien, the cheerful facades of the shops hiding unseen threats. My own shop, when the silent black car deposited me a block away, looked fragile, vulnerable. The lights were still on. The door was still unlocked. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I walked inside, and the scent of the flowers, the scent of my life's work, was now tinged with the metallic smell of fear. I locked the door, a futile gesture. I turned the sign to closed. I stood in the center of my small, quiet world, and for the first time in 24 years, I felt utterly, completely unsafe. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was exactly what my son had intended. He had not just declared war on his father. He had declared war on my peace. The days that followed were a study in quiet paranoia. Every customer who lingered a second too long, every car that slowed as it passed my shop, became a potential threat. The familiar chime of the bell over the door now made my heart leap into my throat. I was living on a razor's edge, in a state of hypervigilance I hadn't experienced since my first few years away from Kwan. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself it was just the shock of seeing him again, of having the past dragged so violently into the present. But I knew I was lying. The fear was real because the threat was real. Jean was out there, a ghost made of my flesh and Kwan's ambition, and he was hunting. I tried to call my friend, Sarah. She was my only link to a normal life, a woman I'd met in a parenting group when Jean was a toddler. Her life was a gentle landscape of school bake sales and book club meetings. I picked up the phone 3 times to call her, to hear a voice that wasn't laden with subtext and unspoken history. 3 times I put it down again. What could I possibly say? My son, who you remember as the quiet boy who was so good at math, is now trying to become a crime lord, and his father, who I told you died in a car accident, is the man he's trying to overthrow. The absurdity of it was a lead weight in my gut. My secret had isolated me more completely than any wall or bodyguard ever could. A week passed. 7 days of silence. I had refused Kwan's offer of overt protection, and to my surprise, he seemed to be respecting my wishes. There were no black cars idling on the corner, no silent men in suits following me on my morning walks. I told myself he had given up, that he had accepted my decision. That was my first mistake. His protection had not vanished. It had simply become invisible again, returning to the form it had held for the last 2 decades. I didn't realize this until Thursday, when the old man who ran the bakery across the street, Mr. Kim, stopped me as I was sweeping the sidewalk. "Your nephew is a very nice boy," he said, his smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "So polite. He has been watching your shop every day." My blood ran cold. "Nephew? I have no nephew." The young man, Mr. Kim clarified, gesturing with his chin towards a nondescript sedan parked half a block down. "He said he was your sister's son, just in town for a few weeks, keeping an eye on things for you. Brought me a coffee this morning. Very respectful." I followed his gaze. The car was gray, boring, forgettable. The man inside was just a silhouette. It wasn't one of Kwan's usual men. The methods had become more subtle. The protection was a ghost, just like the threat. It was a cage woven from whispers and polite fictions. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was followed by a weary, chilling wave of something else. Relief. The anger was for the loss of my autonomy. The relief was for the fact that I was not, in fact, alone. The two emotions warred within me, leaving me exhausted. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark in the small apartment above my shop, staring out the window at the sleeping street. At 2:13 a.m., a sleek, dark motorcycle pulled up across the street. The rider dismounted, leaving the engine running, a low, guttural growl in the quiet night. He was dressed all in black, his face obscured by a helmet. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at my shop, at my home. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Was this him? Was this Jean? The figure raised a hand and beckoned. A van, its headlights off, rolled silently to a stop beside him. 3 men got out. They were carrying something. Not guns. Cans. Spray paint. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. A message. Vandalism. A show of disrespect. They approached my shop, the cheerful green awning I had repainted myself just last spring. And then, something else happened. The door of the gray sedan, my so-called nephew's car, opened. A man got out. He was not large or imposing. He was just a man in a simple jacket. He walked calmly to the center of the street and stood between the vandals and my shop. He didn't say a word. He just stood there. The man on the motorcycle seemed to look at him, then back at my window. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was looking right at me. He could see my silhouette in the dark. He lifted a hand, not in a wave, but with 2 fingers extended, a gesture that was both a greeting and a threat. Then he nodded curtly to his men. They got back in the van. He swung a leg over his motorcycle and roared off into the night, the sound swallowed by the sleeping city. The man from the sedan stood in the street for another minute, a silent sentinel. Then he got back into his car. The crisis, if it could be called that, was over. It had lasted less than 3 minutes. No words exchanged, no violence, just a quiet, terrifying display of boundaries and power. A conversation held in the language of shadows. My son had come to mark his territory. His father had shown him the line he was not yet permitted to cross. And I was the territory. I was the line. I sank to the floor, my legs no longer able to hold me. My hands were trembling, not from fear, not entirely. It was the crushing weight of understanding. I had told Kwan I would not be kept. I had told him I would not live in a box. But I was already in one. I had been for 24 years. It was a box painted to look like freedom, a box whose walls were invisible but absolute. And my son, my beautiful lost boy, had just arrived to rattle the bars. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. It was heavy, made of thick, cream-colored paper. My name, Hannah, was written on the front in a script that was elegant and unfamiliar. Inside, there was no letter, just a single, small, black-and-white photograph, worn and creased at the edges. It was of a young man, no older than 20, with a defiant smile and dark, intense eyes. He was leaning against a brick wall, a cigarette dangling from his lips. It was Kwon. A version of Kwon I had never known from a time before he was Kwon the monolith. A time when he was just a boy with a dangerous smile. Tucked behind the photo was a small, pressed flower. A dried edelweiss. My breath caught. It was our flower. The one he had climbed a ridiculous, treacherous cliff to pick for me on our first and only vacation. A weekend in the mountains that felt like a stolen lifetime. He had told me it meant noble courage. He had given it to me and said, "This is you." I had kept it pressed in a book for years, until it crumbled to dust. I didn't know he had one, too. I didn't know he had kept it for 24 years. There was no message, no threat, no demand, just a photograph and a flower. A memory. It was a move of breathtaking intimacy and strategic genius. It wasn't a message for me, the flower shop owner. It was a message for Hannah, the girl who had loved a boy on a mountain. Jean was trying to start a war with his father's power, his territory, his wealth. And Kwon had just reminded me, and perhaps himself, that the war had started long ago, and it had been fought over a single, fragile, unkillable thing. A memory. I spent the rest of the day in a fog. The photograph and the flower were a ghost in my pocket, a weight against my hip. I watered the plants. I trimmed the roses. I answered the phone. I performed the motions of my life, but I was somewhere else. I was on a mountain, the air crisp and cold. A boy with a dangerous smile holding out a small white flower. I was in a sterile hospital room, a tiny baby in my arms, signing a name on a birth certificate that was a lie and a prayer. I was in 100 moments at once, the past and present collapsing into a single, unbearable point. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I closed the shop early. I went upstairs and I cooked. I made japshi, the glass noodles glistening, the vegetables cut into precise, uniform matchsticks. I made it the way his mother had taught me, the way he liked it, with extra mushrooms and not too sweet. I didn't know why I was doing it. It was a compulsion, a form of prayer, an act of something. I told myself I was just hungry. I told myself it was better than ordering takeout. I set the table for one. The plate, the chopsticks, the small bowl of kimchi. I sat down. I looked at the empty chair across from me, and I waited. I didn't know who I was waiting for. Kwon? Jean? A ghost? The food grew cold on the plate. The silence in the small apartment was absolute. At 9:42 p.m., there was a knock on the door. Not the door to the street, but the inner door at the top of the stairs that led from the shop. It was a soft knock. 2 taps. A pause. 1 tap. It was a code I hadn't heard in a lifetime. My heart stopped. It was his code. I stood up, my legs unsteady. I walked to the door. I opened it. It was not Kwon. It was Mr. Choi. He stood there, impassive as ever. His gaze flickered past me, into the apartment. He saw the table set for one, the uneaten food. His expression didn't change, but I felt, for a fleeting instant, the ghost of something like pity in his eyes. "He sent me," Mr. Choi said, his voice a low rumble. "He asks if you are well." "I'm fine," I said. The words were a bitter joke now. We both knew it. I think he knew it. "He said you would say that," Mr. Choi continued, his eyes fixed on a point just over my shoulder. "He also said to give you this." He held out a hand. In his palm was a small velvet box. Not a ring box. Something longer. I took it. My fingers brushed his. His skin was cool and dry. I opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a key. It was an old-fashioned skeleton key, ornate and heavy. "What is this?" I whispered. "It is for the garden," he said. "The one on the roof. He said you would know what to do. He says the roses need tending." He bowed his head, a gesture of finality, turned, and walked silently back down the stairs. I closed the door. I was alone again. A key to a garden I didn't know existed. The roses need tending. It was a message, wrapped in a riddle, wrapped in a memory. Before I had the flower shop, I had a small window box. I had tried to grow roses, miniature ones. They had struggled in the city air. Kwan had built me a small greenhouse on the roof of that first apartment, a glass jewel box where my roses had finally thrived. He had called it my garden. I leaned my head against the cool wood of the door. This was the game. The one they were both playing, with me as the board. Jean sent threats. Kwan sent memories. One was a fist. The other was a hand, reaching for mine in the dark. I didn't know which was more dangerous. I looked at the key in my hand. It was an invitation. It was a test. And it was a choice. I walked back to the table, picked up the cold plate of food, and scraped it into the trash. Then I put the key in my pocket. Tomorrow I would go to him. Tomorrow I would see this garden. I told myself it was to get answers. I told myself it was to put an end to this. But as I stood in the quiet darkness of my apartment, the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling, I knew I was going because he had asked me to. And because a part of me, the part that had been dormant for 24 years, wanted to see if roses could still grow in his world. The next day dawned gray and melancholy, the sky the color of washed-out flannel. Suited my mood. I opened the shop on time, a creature of habit. I sold a bouquet of sunflowers to a young man for a first date. I helped a woman choose white carnations for a funeral. The small, ordinary dramas of life unfolded around me, but I felt detached, an observer behind glass. The key in my pocket was a heavy, constant reminder of the other drama, the one playing out in the shadows. At noon, I put a back in 15 minutes sign on the door, a lie of laughable proportions, and walked to the corner where the black car had picked me up before. I didn't know if it would be there. I didn't know if I was supposed to call. The rules of this new, old game were opaque to me. But as I rounded the corner, it was there. The same black sedan, a silent predator in a sea of ordinary cars. This time, the back door opened before I even reached it. Mr. Choi was not in attendance. The driver was a young man I didn't recognize, his face smooth and unreadable. I got in. The silence was immediate, absolute. He didn't ask where I was going. He already knew. We drove. We ascended. Back to the tower of glass and steel. This time, I was not a prisoner being summoned. I was a visitor with a key. Felt different. I told myself it felt different. The elevator opened into the vast, empty space. He wasn't there. The room was exactly as it had been, sterile and perfect, the city sprawling beneath it. For a moment, I felt a pang of disappointment so sharp it was like a physical pain. He wasn't here. Of course he wasn't. He didn't wait for people. People waited for him. Then I saw it. On the single stone table, another velvet box. This one was larger. I approached it cautiously. I opened it. Inside, nestled in satin, was a pair of gardening shears and a pair of soft leather gloves. And a note. One sentence in his sharp, angular handwriting. The door is behind the library wall. I looked at the wall of books, a floor-to-ceiling edifice of leather-bound volumes that looked as if they had been purchased by the yard. It was a prop, a piece of set dressing. I ran my hand along the spines, searching for a catch, a seam. Nothing. I felt foolish, a character in a bad spy movie. Then my fingers brushed against a book that was slightly different. The leather was worn, the gold leaf faded. The title was a collection of poetry by a writer I had loved, one I had read aloud to him in the early days. My hand trembled as I pulled it. There was a soft click, and a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a narrow, spiral staircase. The air that drifted up was cool and damp, smelling of earth and rain. I picked up the box with the shears and gloves and I started to climb. The staircase led to a heavy wooden door. There was a large, old-fashioned lock. The key from my pocket slid in with a satisfying click. I turned it, pushed the door open, and stepped out into another world. I was on the roof, but it was not a roof. It was a garden. A secret, impossible garden suspended 40 stories in the air, encased in a massive glass atrium that was open in places to the sky. There were stone pathways, a small, gurgling fountain, and beds bursting with flowers I hadn't seen in years. And roses. There were roses everywhere. Climbing roses draping the glass walls, bush roses in vibrant reds and pale pinks. And in the center, a bed of the most exquisite, perfect white roses I had ever seen. The air was thick with their scent. It was overwhelming. It was beautiful. It was a monument to a memory. And he was there. He was on his knees in front of the bed of white roses, not in a suit or a sweater, but in a simple, worn work shirt, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He had a small trowel in his hand, and there was a smudge of dirt on his jaw. He was tending the roses. He looked up as I approached, his face unreadable. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "They are not doing well," he said, his voice quiet. "The white ones. I think the soil is wrong." He gestured to one of the plants. The leaves were yellowing at the edges. A few of the blooms were starting to brown. I walked over, my shoes crunching on the gravel path. I knelt down beside him, the distance between us no more than a foot. The scent of the earth was rich and real. I put on the gloves from the box. They fit perfectly. I took the shears. I touched the soil. It was too dense, too wet. "They're drowning," I said. "You're giving them too much water. And the soil needs sand. It needs to breathe." He watched me, his dark eyes following the movement of my hands as I gently loosened the earth around the base of the plant. We were just two people in a garden talking about roses. It was absurd. It was the most normal thing we had done in 24 years. "You always knew," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You always knew how to make things grow." I kept my eyes on the rose bush. If I looked at him, I was afraid of what I might see, or what he might see in me. "You built all this," I said, my voice tight, "for a memory. Is a memory not worth preserving?" He asked. He wasn't being rhetorical. He wanted to know. "Memories are heavy," I said, snipping a dead bloom from the stem with the shears. "They can drown you, too." He was silent for a long time. I could feel his gaze on me. I kept working, my movements precise, focused. It was easier to focus on the roses. The roses were a problem I could solve. "I have thought about that decision many times since," he said finally. "The decision to send you away. I have replayed it 1,000 times. I have tried to find another path, another way it could have gone. There wasn't one. My enemies at the time, they were not like these boys today. They were not interested in territory. They were interested in pain. They would have taken you. They would have used you to break me. And they would have succeeded." I stopped working. My hand, holding the shears, was still. I looked at him then. For the first time, really looked at him, without the armor of my anger, without the filter of my hurt. I saw the man from the photograph, the boy with the dangerous smile, trapped inside this powerful, lonely figure. I saw the truth of his words in the exhaustion that lay deep in his eyes. "You could have told me," I whispered. "You could have let me choose." He gave a short, bitter laugh. It was a shocking sound. "You would have chosen to stay," he said. "You would have chosen to stand by my side and fight. And we would have lost. I could not let you make that choice. Your courage was always your most beautiful and most dangerous quality. I could not let it kill you." The honesty of it was a physical blow. He had not sent me away because he didn't love me. He had sent me away because he did. The narrative I had built my life on, the story of my rejection and his coldness, crumbled to dust, like the pressed Edelweiss. In its place was a much more complicated, much more painful truth. He had not abandoned me. He had sacrificed me, and himself. "I don't know this man," I said, my voice barely audible. "The man our son has become." "He is my son too," Quan said, his voice flat. "He has my ambition, my arrogance. He has just not yet learned my patience. He thinks the world can be taken by force. He does not understand that true power is not in taking. It is in holding, and in knowing what to let go." He reached out then, not to touch me, but to a stray strand of my hair that had escaped my clip and fallen across my face. His fingers brushed my cheek as he tucked it behind my ear. His touch was feather-light, but it burned like a brand. It was a gesture of such profound intimacy, so achingly familiar, that it broke something open inside me. 2 seconds. The touch lasted 2 seconds longer than the conversation required. I counted. A tear I hadn't realized I was holding back slid down my cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just let his thumb rest on my jaw for a moment, a silent acknowledgement. A discreet cough from the doorway of the staircase broke the spell. Mr. Choi was standing there, his face as impassive as ever, but his presence was a clear interruption. There was news. Kwan's jaw tightened. The gardener was gone. The master of the city was back. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. He was once again the monolith, the man of steel and shadow. "Stay," he said. It was not a command. It was a plea. "Stay here, in the garden, as long as you like." He turned and walked away without another word, following Mr. Choi down the spiral stairs. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone with the roses and the silent, sprawling city below. I looked at my hands, covered in his soil. I was in his world. I was in his garden. And for the first time, it did not feel like a cage. It felt like the only safe place on earth. I stayed in the garden for hours. The gray sky broke, and a soft, persistent rain began to fall, pattering against the glass roof of the atrium. The sound was comforting, a gentle percussion that washed out the noise of the city and the noise in my head. I worked. I mixed sand into the dense, wet soil around the white roses. I pruned the dead leaves, my movements rhythmic and sure. It was good to have a task, a problem with a tangible solution. The roses did not have a complicated past. They did not have sons who were trying to kill their fathers. They just needed a little care, a little room to breathe. I understood that. As dusk began to fall, painting the rainy city in bruised golds and purples, a woman I had never seen before came up the spiral staircase. She was older, with kind eyes and hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple, clean uniform. A housekeeper. She didn't speak, but she smiled gently and gestured for me to follow her. She led me not to the main elevator, but down a different hallway, one I hadn't noticed, to a suite of rooms. They were nothing like the cold, minimalist space below. These rooms were warm, inviting. There was a comfortable-looking bed, a small sofa piled with cashmere throws, and shelves filled with actual books, some with bookmarks peeking out. The light was soft, amber. On a table, a meal was waiting for me under a silver cloche. It was a simple meal. Rice, soup, some steamed vegetables. It was a gilded cage, I knew that. A beautiful, comfortable prison designed to keep me safe and contained. I should have been angry. I should have been demanding to leave. But I was just tired. A bone-deep weariness that 24 years of self-reliance had created. For one night, I told myself I would let someone else take care of me. For one night, I would not be strong. I would just be. The housekeeper, whose name I learned was Mrs. Park, showed me the bathroom, the closet filled with simple, elegant clothes in my size, and then, with another small bow, she left me alone. I ate the food. It was delicious. I took a long, hot shower. The water pressure was perfect. Everything in Kwan's world was perfect. I put on a soft, gray silk robe that felt like water against my skin. I stood at the window. From this side of the building, I couldn't see the whole city, just a sliver of the river, a black ribbon stitched with light. It was quieter here, more peaceful. I told myself it was an illusion. And then, for the first time in a very long time, I didn't argue with myself. I slept, a deep, dreamless sleep that was a surrender. When I woke, the sun was streaming through the window. The rain had passed. The city looked clean, reborn. There was a tray with coffee and a croissant by the bed. There was also a single, perfect white rose in a crystal vase. It was from the bush I had tended. It was no longer drowning. For 3 weeks, this became my routine. I would wake, have coffee, and then I would go to the garden. I spent my days there with the roses. I learned the rhythms of the atrium, the way the light changed throughout the day, the way the different flowers released their scents in the evening. Mrs. Park would bring me lunch. Sometimes we would talk. She had worked for Kwan's family since he was a boy. She spoke of him not as a fearsome boss, but as a lonely man who had forgotten how to be anything else. She told me he had built the garden himself with 2 other men over a single winter 15 years ago. She said he came up here sometimes late at night and just sat. She never said why. She didn't have to. I did not see Kwan during this time. He was a ghost in his own home. I would hear the elevator at odd hours, see a dark car arriving or leaving the garage below. I knew he was fighting a war. A quiet, brutal war for the soul of his city, and for the soul of his son. Sometimes Mr. Choi would appear at the door of the garden. He would never speak. He would just stand there for a moment, a silent confirmation that Kwan was aware of me, that I was still under his watch. It was a strange, suspended existence. I was not a prisoner, but I was not free. I was a guest in a fortress. One afternoon, Sarah called. My friend. My link to the other world. Her name flashed on the screen of the small, featureless phone Mrs. Park had given me. My heart leaped into my throat. I had not spoken to her in a month. Hannah? She said, her voice tight with worry. Oh my God. Are you okay? The shop has been closed for weeks. I've been calling and calling. I was about to file a missing persons report. I leaned against the glass wall of the atrium, the city a dizzying blur below. What could I say? I'm fine, Sarah, I said. The lie was so practiced, so smooth. I'm just on a trip. An unexpected family matter. Family? She asked, confused. I thought you didn't have any family. The question hung in the air. My carefully curated lie, the one I had lived for 2 decades, was unraveling. It's complicated, I said, my voice weak. There was a pause. I'm your friend, Hannah, she said, her voice soft but firm. You can tell me anything. You know that. And in that moment I wanted to. I wanted to pour out the whole insane, impossible story. But I couldn't. It wasn't my story alone to tell. It was a story that could get her killed. I know, I said, and my voice broke.
I'm sorry, Sarah.
I have to go. I'll call you when I can. I'll explain everything. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. The conversation had been a brief, painful window into the life I had lost. Or perhaps the life I had never truly had. I had been living a lie for so long, I no longer knew who I was without it. That evening, the air in the penthouse changed. The quiet, suspended peace was replaced by a low, humming tension. Mrs. Park was quieter than usual. The few staff members I glimpsed in the hallways moved with a new urgency. Something was happening. The war was coming to a head. At 10 p.m., Kwan came to the garden. He didn't have dirt on his face this time. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit. He looked tired, older than he had 3 weeks ago. He looked like a man who had been to hell and back. He stood by the fountain, not looking at me. It's done, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. What's done? I asked, my heart pounding. The situation with Jean has been resolved. Resolved? What does that mean? Is he? I couldn't bring myself to say the word. Dead. He turned to look at me then, and his eyes were black holes of exhaustion. No, he said. He is not dead. He is on a plane to Switzerland. He will run the European side of the business. A legitimate business. Banking. Investments. He is very good with numbers. You taught him that. It was a banishment. A gilded exile. He had not killed his son. He had promoted him to the other side of the world. It was a solution that was both merciful and cruel, a move of perfect, calculated power. He agreed to this? I asked, incredulous. He had no choice, Kwan said. I made it clear what the alternative was. I took everything from him, Hannah. His network, his money, his people. I left him with nothing but his name. And then I gave him a new world to conquer. It was a compromise. And what about you? I asked. What did it cost you? He looked away, his gaze falling on the white roses, which were now thriving, their blooms luminous in the moonlight. Cost me a son, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I have a new business partner in Europe. But my son is gone. We stood in silence for a long time, the gurgle of the fountain the only sound. The war was over. The threat was gone. My reason for being here was gone. You can go home now, Hannah, he said, his back still to me. Mr. Choi can take you in the morning. Your shop, I have had it looked after. Everything is as you left it. You are free to go. He said the words I had been waiting to hear, the words I had told myself I wanted. You are free. But they didn't feel like freedom. They felt like a knife. He was letting me go. Again. He was making the choice for me. Again. And that was when I finally understood. The fierce autonomy I had guarded for so long was a shield against being hurt. It was a wall I had built to keep from feeling the pain of his rejection. But it hadn't been rejection. It had been a sacrifice. And his protection, the thing I had railed against, was not about control. It was his language. It was the only way he knew how to say I love you. It was a clumsy, imperfect, and powerful language, and I had refused to learn it. I walked over to him, my steps silent on the stone path.